The crystal chandelier cast a blinding glare across the dining room. At least 8 different courses were laid out on the long mahogany table, but no one was eating. Caleb picked up his wine glass and walked over to Asher, a flawless smile on his face. "Asher, you're finally home," he said, his voice smooth, with just the right amount of tremor. "This family is finally whole again." Asher didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the brand-new set of silverware placed before him. The next second, crash! The sharp sound of shattering glass exploded in the quiet room. Caleb stumbled backward as if he'd been violently shoved, landing hard on the floor. A dark red stain blossomed across his expensive white dress shirt. He looked up, his eyes instantly welling with tears, his voice trembling with shocked disbelief. "Asher, I know you hate me. I know you blame me for taking the life that should have been yours for 20 years. But you can't. You can't do this to me." A dead silence fell over the room. Then Richard Vance slammed his fist on the table, the solid wood groaning under the impact. He pointed a shaking finger at Asher, the veins in his forehead bulging. "Asher, what the hell are you doing? Caleb welcomes you home with open arms, and you throw wine on him? You push him down?" Eleanor immediately rushed to Caleb's side, cradling him in her arms. She looked at Asher, her eyes blazing with fury and disappointment. "We brought you here because we felt sorry for you, living out there all alone, not so you could come back and bully Caleb. How could you be so cruel?" Asher finally moved. He slowly raised his eyes, first glancing at the shattered crystal and spilled red wine on the floor, then at Caleb, who was trembling at his feet in an Oscar-worthy performance. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't even stand up. He just leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze landing on Caleb's tear-streaked face. The corner of his mouth twitched into a faint, almost invisible smirk. His voice was quiet, yet it cut straight through Caleb's fake sobs. "Nice scene. The look, the lines, the emotional delivery. All spot on." Caleb's crying hitched for a fraction of a second. Asher's gaze swept over the glass shards on the Persian rug. He continued in that same, level tone, laced with a hint of amusement. "You just missed a key detail. Next time, shatter your own glass. The one you just broke was an 82 law fight. What a waste." Caleb's expression froze, the fabricated tears forgotten. Richard and Eleanor were also stunned into silence, seemingly unable to process the unexpected response. Asher ignored them, pushed his chair back with a short screech against the hardwood floor, and stood up. "I'm full." He tossed the words over his shoulder and turned, walking toward his room upstairs. His back was straight, showing not a single trace of the anger or panic of a man wrongly accused. Caleb watched him go. Hidden from his parents' view, his lips slowly curled into a cold, defiant smirk. Click! The bedroom door shut softly. Asher leaned his back against it, the room cloaked in darkness. All expression vanished from his face, leaving only a faint glint deep in his eyes, like the first wisp of smoke rising from a dormant volcano. It wasn't anger. It was, finally, this might get interesting. For the next few days, the atmosphere in the Vance mansion was as oppressive as the air before a thunderstorm. Asher remained the same, silent, distant, and utterly indifferent to Caleb's provocations, both overt and subtle. This complete lack of reaction made Caleb's performance feel like punching a pillow, leaving him frustrated and stewing. He needed to escalate. One afternoon, timing it for when he knew his parents would be heading upstairs for their afternoon rest, Caleb accidentally ran into Asher at the top of the grand staircase. "Asher," Caleb said, blocking his path. His voice was soft, but his eyes were sharp as needles. "Can we please talk? I know you misunderstand me, and I really want to make things right." Asher didn't stop, merely sidestepping to get around him. Now, a vicious gleam flashed in Caleb's eyes. He feigned a trip, let out a short, terrified scream, and threw himself backward, tumbling violently down the stairs. In the split second he lost his balance, his hand shot out, instinctively grabbing for Asher's arm. If he made contact, the accusation of being pushed would be sealed. Asher, why did you push me?" The piercing shriek, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the carpeted steps, echoed through the entire house. "Caleb, oh my God!" As predicted, Richard and Eleanor came rushing out of the master bedroom and the study. The scene that greeted them was damning. Caleb was curled in a heap at the bottom of the stairs, a red welt already forming on his forehead, tears streaming down his face. And Asher was standing at the top of the landing, his posture perfectly relaxed, with his hands still tucked in his pockets. He hadn't even taken them out. Asher! Richard's eyes went bloodshot. He practically roared as he scrambled down the stairs to check on Caleb, while Eleanor was already sobbing, cradling Caleb and murmuring his name. "You monster! You animal!" Richard snapped his head up, pointing at Asher, his whole body trembling with rage. "First the wine glass. Now you push him down the stairs. Are you trying to kill him? How do we end up with a heartless snake like you in this family?" Blinded by fury, he charged back up the stairs, his hand raised to strike Asher across the face. Cradled in Eleanor's arms, Caleb watched through his blurry tears, a triumphant smirk fighting its way onto his lips. It worked, this time with witnesses and physical evidence. Asher had no way out. Just as Richard's hand was about to connect, Asher moved. Still keeping his hands in his pockets, he tilted his head just enough to dodge the slap. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost cruel, he spoke. "Dad, before you do that, you might want to see this." He slowly pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. A video began to play. The angle was from a security camera, perfectly capturing the top of the staircase. The picture was crystal clear, the audio pristine. On the screen, Caleb deliberately blocks Asher's path. Caleb speaks, his eyes darting around. Then, Caleb throws himself backward, his hand reaching for Asher. But Asher, as if anticipating it, keeps his hands in his pockets and leans his upper body back just an inch, perfectly avoiding any possible contact. Caleb didn't even brush the fabric of his jacket. The clip ended with Caleb's masterfully acted scream, "Asher, why did you push me?" The video finished. The house was utterly silent. Richard's hand froze midair, his rage curdling into absolute shock and disbelief. Eleanor stopped crying, staring blankly from Asher's phone to the boy in her arms that Caleb's tears were still wet on his cheeks, but his face had gone rigid. The blood drained from his face, making the red mark on his forehead seem even more pronounced. Asher put his phone away and looked down at Caleb, who now seemed pathetically comical crumpled at the bottom of the stairs. His tone was that of a professional offering a critique. "Next time you pull a stunt like this, make sure you check for cameras first." He paused, adding with no discernible emotion, "And when you fake a fall, you need to engage your core to control the landing. Your form was sloppy, your landing was awkward. It looked completely fake, very unprofessional." Without another glance at the three of them and their spectacular range of expressions, he turned, hands still in his pockets, and strolled back to his room. Click! This time, the sound of the door closing was like a sharp slap across Caleb's face, and Richard's and Eleanor's as well. Downstairs, the only sound was Caleb's ragged breathing, heavy with panic and shame. The drama at the Vance mansion was impossible to contain within the elite circles of Greenwich. In an effort to restore the family's image, and also to put Asher in his place, Richard decided to take him to a gala following a major financial summit in the city. The hotel ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers, designer gowns, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Caleb was in his element, the darling of this kind of event. He moved with grace, his conversation was witty, and he was soon surrounded by a fawning circle of heirs and socialites. He deliberately left Asher isolated in a corner, making the simple, off-the-rack suit he wore look even more out of place. "Asher, don't just stand there. Have something to eat," Caleb said, gliding over with a glass of champagne. His voice was pitched just right for the people nearby to overhear. "You probably don't get many chances to try caviar like this." The condescension and charity in his tone were unmistakable. A few of the young men nearby snickered. Asher didn't react, his eyes scanning the elaborate food displays without interest. Caleb decided the moment was right. He elegantly slipped a card from the inner pocket of his bespoke suit. It was a sleek black card with a fine gold trim, bearing the Vance Corporation's family crest, a supplementary, unlimited credit black card. "Dad gave this to me the other day. Said it was time for me to start learning how to manage some family affairs," Caleb said, flashing the card with a look of concern toward Asher. You just got back, so you must be short on cash. Here, whatever you want, whatever you need to buy, just use this. After all, we're family." The gesture was magnanimous, the delivery flawless. Murmurs of approval rippled through his audience. "Caleb, you're too generous." "Yeah, Asher, your brother is looking out for you. That's the Centurion card, isn't it? The credit on that is insane." Across the room, Richard and Eleanor watched with nods of satisfaction, pleased that Caleb was finally showing some grace. All eyes were now on Asher, waiting to see how he would handle this public act of charity. Would he lash out in anger, or swallow his pride and accept it? Asher finally made a move. He raised a hand and rubbed his nose, looking faintly bored by the whole affair. Then, as everyone watched, he reached into the pocket of his generic blue jeans. He pulled out a worn, plain leather wallet. The smirk on Caleb's face widened with undisguised contempt. The onlookers leaned in, sensing the climax of the drama. Asher flipped the wallet open, and without even looking, pulled out a card and tossed it onto the white linen of the tabletop. Tink! It was a quiet sound. The card was also black, but it was nothing like Caleb's, which gleamed with metallic foil and holographic security features. This card was a deep, absolute matte black that seemed to absorb all light. It had no bank name, no logo, no card number, not even a visible magnetic strip or chip. In the center, there was only a string of strange, flowing symbols that seemed to glow with a faint, dark gold light, unlike any known alphabet or numeral. It lay there, so plain it was almost pathetic, yet radiated an indescribable and unsettling aura. "What? What is that?" One of the young men couldn't help but snort. "A gift card from an arcade?" Caleb laughed, a magnanimous and pitying sound. "Asher, did you pick that up at a convention or something? This really isn't the place for jokes." Just then, a commotion stirred at the ballroom entrance. An elderly gentleman in an impeccably tailored suit, radiating an aura of immense power, entered briskly, flanked by several assistants. The event's hosts immediately rushed over, their faces wreathed in anxious smiles. "It's Mr. Smith, the Asia-Pacific president of Cosmos Capital. What's he doing here? I can't believe they got him to attend." Mr. Smith exchanged brief pleasantries with the hosts, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for someone. Suddenly, his gaze locked onto their corner of the room, or more precisely, onto the strange black card on the table. The casual authority on his face vanished, replaced by utter shock, which quickly morphed into something that looked like terror. He practically shoved people out of his way, stumbling in his haste. As the entire ballroom watched in stunned silence, he half ran, half stumbled over to Asher. Then, in the dead quiet room, this titan of global finance, a man whose every word could shake markets, bowed. He bent at the waist until he was at a perfect 90-degree angle, his head lowered before Asher and the strange black card. Beads of sweat popped out on his forehead. His voice, when he spoke, was a choked, trembling whisper, mangled by his effort to speak perfect, respectful English. Honored sovereign. Sir, what is a person of your stature doing in a place like this? My deepest apologies for not being here to receive you. It is an unforgivable oversight. Please, is there anything I can do for you?" You could have heard a pin drop. Every single mocking, pitying, and curious gaze in the room froze, then shattered into a million pieces of fear and confusion. Caleb's unlimited black card had, at some point, slipped from his fingers and fallen to the floor. The card, once a shining symbol of wealth and power, now looked like a cheap piece of plastic next to the matte black, arcade token on the table. Asher didn't even look at the bowing Mr. Smith. His gaze finally settled on Caleb's ashen face. He spoke calmly. "You dropped your card." After the Gala incident, a strange and unsettling calm descended upon the Vance household. Richard and Eleanor now looked at Asher with a complex mixture of fear and confusion. As for Caleb, his profound humiliation festered into a deeper, more venomous resolve. "If I can't crush you with money, I'll use real power and connections to destroy you completely." An opportunity soon presented itself. The Vance Corporation was hosting a launch ceremony for a major international project, requiring top-tier security. Richard, intending to test both his sons, divided the preparations. Caleb was in charge of the high-profile guest list and event planning, while the seemingly simpler, yet far more critical, task of on-site security and logistics was handed to Asher. It was a blatant setup, and it was the chance Caleb had been waiting for. Asher, security for an event like this is a tough job, Caleb said, approaching Asher, who was looking over the event prospectus. Caleb wore a flawless mask of brotherly concern. You need the most professional team, the best connections. I have some pull in that circle. Do you want me to make a few calls for you? Asher didn't look up from the booklet. Don't trouble yourself. A dark look flashed in Caleb's eyes, but his smile remained. All right then. Well, good luck. He turned and walked away, a cold sneer on his lips. Keep pretending. Let's see how long you can keep this act up. Caleb immediately started working his connections, calling the heads of every major private security firm in the country, especially the industry leader, Aegis Security. Mr. Wallace, it's Caleb Vance. Richard Vance's son. Mr. Vance, to what do I owe the pleasure? No pleasure, just a small heads up. For our company's upcoming event, the other person in charge. Well, it's my recently returned brother, Asher. He might contact you for a quote. Whatever he offers, I'm asking that your company decline the job. The Vance family would owe you a favor. The CEO on the other end, Mr. Wallace, was enthusiastically cooperative. Say no more, Mr. Vance. I understand completely. We won't let your brother interfere with the success of the event. Hanging up, Caleb was flush with triumph. He could already picture Asher, desperate and defeated, getting rejected at every turn. Without a top security team, any minor incident at the event would be enough to finish him. The next few days went exactly as Caleb had planned. His own preparations were seamless, while every reputable security firm turned Asher down, citing scheduling conflicts or lack of resources. Caleb even helpfully suggested a few third-rate security guard services, which Asher pointedly ignored. The day before the event, Caleb deliberately brought it up at a family meeting. Asher, is the security team locked in? The event is tomorrow. If you haven't found anyone, I have a backup option. They're not great, but it's better than nothing. Asher, who was typing an email on his phone, just grunted in acknowledgement and said nothing more. Caleb took this as a sign of stubborn pride in the face of failure and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. On the day of the launch, the sky was a perfect blue. The venue was exquisitely decorated, and a stream of high-profile guests began to arrive. Caleb, dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit, moved through the crowd, making small talk and soaking in the compliments, all while keeping an eye on the entrance, eagerly awaiting the inevitable disaster of Asher's making. As the start time approached and guests were about to be seated, a convoy of black, armored SUVs moved in, silent as predators. They drove past the main entrance and positioned themselves with military precision at every key point around the venue's perimeter. The doors opened in unison, and teams of security personnel emerged. Dressed in black tactical gear, heavily equipped, and with eyes as sharp as hawks, they moved with swift, disciplined efficiency. In moments, they had established a secure perimeter and taken control of every access point, their professionalism and intimidating presence far surpassing the first-class team Caleb had hired for guest relations. The guests were taken aback by the display, murmuring amongst themselves about which dignitary had warranted such an elite detail. Caleb froze, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. This wasn't any team he knew. He watched as the commander of the black-clad unit, a powerfully built man with a face like carved granite, scanned the area before his eyes locked onto Asher, who was standing quietly in a corner. The commander strode purposefully toward him. In front of the stunned onlookers, he stopped a yard away from Asher, snapped to attention, and delivered a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. His voice boomed with absolute respect. Sir, Aegis Security, 1st Special Operations Division, all 36 agents deployed. The perimeter is secure and the venue is clear. Awaiting your orders, sir. Sir. The smile on Caleb's face shattered. His mind went blank. Aegis Security, the very company he had personally called to blacklist Asher, and they were calling Asher. Sir? Asher finally looked up from his phone and glanced at the commander. He gave a slight, dismissive nod. Proceed as planned. Yes, sir. The commander saluted again, spun on his heel, and walked off, not even sparing Caleb a glance. The reality of the situation crashed down on Caleb. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed Mr. Wallace's number. He practically screamed into the receiver. "Wallace, what the hell is going on? What are you men doing here? Why do they call Asher, sir?" On the other end, Mr. Wallace's voice was strangely calm, almost amused. "Mr. Vance, what a question. Mr. Thorne is the sole proprietor of Aegis Security. He owns the entire company. When a boss wants to use his own people for a job, who are we as employees to stop him? Sole proprietor. The boss." Caleb felt like he'd been struck by lightning. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the marble floor and cracking the screen. He remembered his triumphant phone call, Wallace's eager agreement. He wasn't being placated. He was being mocked. Wallace had been watching a clown perform. Asher had walked over and was now standing beside him. He bent down, picked up the cracked phone, and handed it back to Caleb. Looking at Caleb's pale, shell-shocked face, Asher leaned in and said, in a voice only he could hear, "I forgot to mention, when you called to have me blacklisted, he sent me a text asking for instructions. My reply was 3 words. Caleb's eyes widened in horror, his gaze locked on Asher. Asher's lips barely moved. Let him play. The Aegis security incident was a hammer blow that not only shattered Caleb's pride, but also destabilized his position within the family. The way Richard and Eleanor looked at him was no longer with unconditional love, but with scrutiny, suspicion, and a sliver of fear. Caleb knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to deliver a fatal blow, one that would bury Asher so deep he could never recover. And the perfect weapon was blood. Using the last of his connections and draining his private funds, he contacted a shadowy hacker-for-hire group known as the Shadow Syndicate, infamous for data fabrication. He also bribed a former technician from the lab that had conducted the original paternity test. Soon, a new narrative began to quietly circulate among the Vance family's inner circle and within the company. Did you hear? There might have been an issue with that first paternity test. I always said, there's nothing about that Asher that seems like a Vance. I heard the samples were contaminated, or maybe even switched on purpose. Caleb is the one who grew up in the family. He's the one we know and trust. The rumors slithered like poison, coiling around Asher's legitimacy. Richard and Eleanor were once again thrown into turmoil. The seed of doubt, once planted, grew with alarming speed. It seemed especially plausible now, after Asher had demonstrated abilities and resources utterly inconsistent with his supposed background as a long-lost orphan. Asher, Eleanor approached him, her voice strained and distant. These rumors. It's not that I don't believe you, it's just, are we absolutely sure that original test was foolproof? Maybe we should have another one done, a more comprehensive one. Richard stood nearby, his face grim. He didn't say a word, but his silence was a clear endorsement. Caleb appeared at the perfect moment, his face pale, but his eyes filled with a righteous resolve. Dad, Mom, I'll do it. I'll take the most advanced genetic sequencing test there is. If Asher is truly advanced by blood, I will leave immediately and give everything back to him. All I want is the truth, to clear Asher's name once and for all. He delivered the lines with the air of a noble martyr, his eyes red-rimmed, as if he were bearing an immense burden. All eyes and all the pressure turned back to Asher. Asher watched the carefully orchestrated performance, Caleb's desperate, all-or-nothing gamble, his parents' wavering loyalty, and he let out a low chuckle. It was a sound filled with a kind of high-level, almost pitying mockery. Do another test? He lifted his gaze, letting it sweep over Caleb before settling on Richard and Eleanor. That won't be necessary. As Caleb watched with an air of impending victory, and his parents watched in confusion, Asher once again took out his plain-looking smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, pulling up a file. With a flick of his thumb, the massive high-definition screen on the conference room wall blinked to life. A complex, three-dimensional model of a spiraling structure filled the screen, covered in dense data points. This was no ordinary DNA report. Its complexity and presentation were far beyond any known public genetic technology. On the left, the genetic sequences of Asher Thorne, Richard Vance, and Eleanor Vance were clearly labeled and compared. The match percentage was 999% followed by a long string of decimals. Furthermore, the diagram visually demonstrated their shared telomere length, recessive genetic markers, and even a high correlation in something labeled bioenergetic frequency. What is this? Richard stared, his heart pounding. He couldn't understand the details, but the staggering match percentage and the familiar names were undeniable. On the right side of the screen was the comparison between Caleb Vance and the elder Van Cess. The match percentage was a glaring crimson red, 0%. But that wasn't the most shocking part. On the helical strand representing Caleb's genetic sequence, several key nodes were highlighted in bright red, with detailed annotations beside them. Sequence fragment, CHR7, Q11, 23. Evidence of artificial gene editing detected. Tool, signature consistent with a CRISPR, Cas9 derivative. Imprinting control region, ICR, H19/IGF2, exhibits non-natural methylation patterns, indicative of in vitro intervention. Telomerase activity, coding region, contains anomalous activation sequence insertion, not inherited from parental genome. A single, bolded conclusion hovered at the bottom of the diagram. Subject Caleb Vance genome exhibits multiple non-natural, artificial edits and modifications inconsistent with natural human heredity. Classification: highly engineered biological construct. The room was so silent you could hear the blood rushing in their ears. Artificial edits? Engineered. Construct? The color drained from Caleb's face. He stumbled backward as if his bones had turned to dust, hitting the wall with a thud. His lips trembled, but no sound came out. Impossible. This is impossible. The Shadow Syndicate swore their work was undetectable. Richard and Eleanor were completely stunned, their heads whipping back and forth between the damning evidence on the screen and the shell-shocked boy they had raised. Their minds couldn't process the reality-shattering information. Asher switched off the display. The screen went dark, returning the room to its normal lighting. He walked over to Caleb, who was practically melting into the floor, and looked down at him as if observing a failed experiment. "You thought your origin was a mystery?" His voice was quiet, but each word was an icicle piercing Caleb's heart. "That's because I couldn't be bothered to read," he paused, delivering the final verdict. A poorly written, discontinued script. The genetic map was the final judgment, crucifying Caleb on a cross of his own artifice. The way Richard and Eleanor looked at him was no longer with disappointment, but with a horrified, detached scrutiny. In the Vance family, he was now an alien presence. The love they'd once felt curdled into ash. Caleb locked himself in his room for 2 days. When he emerged, he was a changed man. The calculating, venomous energy was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed calm and a sickly frailty. He began to exhibit signs of deep depression in front of Richard and Eleanor. Dazed, no appetite. Occasionally, he would clutch his chest, his face pale as he gasped for breath. "Dad, Mom, I'm fine," he would say with a weak smile whenever they asked, his eyes vacant. "I guess I just feel tired, empty." Although they were deeply unsettled by the truth of his origin, 20 years of raising him wasn't so easy to discard. Seeing him in this state stirred a reluctant pity. But this was only the beginning. At an important family dinner, Caleb forced himself to attend. He barely touched his food, the hand holding his water glass trembling slightly. Halfway through the meal, Caleb let out a stifled grunt. The glass slipped from his hand, spilling water down his front. He slumped from his chair and collapsed onto the rug, clawing at his chest. The veins on his forehead stood out, and his face turned a ghastly shade of gray. "Caleb!" Eleanor screamed. "What's happening?" Richard yelled, rushing to his side. Caleb's eyes were shut, his breathing so shallow it was almost undetectable. His body twitched faintly. "Doctor! Call the doctor!" The dinner party erupted into chaos. The family doctor arrived quickly. After a brief examination, he shook his head, his face grim. "This is highly unusual. His heart rate is dangerously low, and his vital signs are fading rapidly. It's like some form of acute organ failure, but I've never seen these symptoms. He needs to be at a top hospital now." An ambulance rushed Caleb to the best private hospital in the state. A team of specialists convened, running every advanced diagnostic imaginable, but the results left them baffled. "We can't find any physical cause," no lesions, no disease, but his life force is just draining away. It's like a case of rapid cellular decay, something you only read about in obscure medical texts. There's nothing we can do. As news spread, the tide of public opinion turned dramatically. Did you hear? That fake heir, the Vance family, is dying of a broken heart, consumed by guilt. How tragic. After 20 years, blood or not, there must be a bond. If you ask me, that real son, Asher, pushed him too far. Exactly. The kid is dying. What's there left to forgive? Online and in gossip columns, a narrative began to form. Caleb was a tragic victim, and Asher was the cold-hearted monster who had driven him to his deathbed. Lying in the ICU, hooked up to a forest of tubes and machines, Caleb was the picture of a dying man. He weakly opened his eyes to look at Richard and Eleanor, who were gathered at his bedside. "Dad, Mom," he rasped. Don't blame Asher. It was my fault. I stole his life. My only wish is to have his forgiveness. Then I can go in peace." It was the performance of a lifetime, a dying man's confession delivered with heartbreaking sincerity. Richard and Eleanor broke down completely. In that moment, all the fear and resentment they felt toward Caleb's true nature was washed away by the raw pain of losing the boy they had raised for 2 decades. The public outcry grew, demanding that Asher show some humanity and grant a dying man his final wish. The pressure, once again, was on Asher. Followed by a swarm of cameras and watched by a crowd of onlookers, Asher finally arrived at the hospital. He walked straight into the ICU, not even bothering with a protective gown. Reporters tried to follow, but it felt as if they had hit an invisible wall at the doorway. Inside the room, it was just the two of them. Asher walked to the bedside and looked down at the monitor displaying a cardiac rhythm so faint it seemed ready to flatline at any moment. Then he looked at Caleb's face, his eyes closed, but his eyelids fluttering almost imperceptibly. Asher leaned down close to Caleb's ear and spoke in a voice that was cold, quiet, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Stop faking. This rapid decay syndrome you're pulling. It's based on a flawed prototype I threw in the trash 300 years ago. The effects are weak. The side effects are a mess. It's useless for anything other than tricking mortals." As he finished speaking, Asher snapped his fingers. Snap. The sound was quiet, but it hit Caleb's soul like a bolt of lightning. On the bed, Caleb's eyes flew open. They weren't cloudy or weak. They were sharp with pure, unadulterated shock and rage. He shot up in bed as if yanked by an invisible string, ripping the electrodes from his chest and tearing off the oxygen mask. His face flushed with color as he pointed a finger at Asher and roared, his voice booming with vitality. "That's bullshit, Asher. You're the flawed prototype. Your whole family is a flawed prototype." The moment the words left his mouth, Caleb froze. He saw it then. Through the large glass window of the ICU room, he saw Richard and Eleanor. He saw dozens of reporters with their cameras raised. And on every single face was a look of complete, utter, and comical disbelief. They were all staring at him, staring at the man who, just moments before, had been declared at death's door, and who was now sitting up, screaming insults, the very picture of health. Caleb looked down at himself, then back at the sea of frozen faces outside the window. A massive explosion went off in his head, leaving nothing but white noise. It's over. The hospital fiasco ended with Richard slapping Caleb across the face in full view of the media. Vilified online and disgraced in public, Caleb was cast out. The Vance family home was no longer his. 20 years of deception, planning, and manipulation had evaporated in an instant, leaving only a legacy of shame. He holed up in a dingy basement apartment, his eyes bloodshot as he stared at a picture of Asher's calm, indifferent face on his laptop screen. Hatred was a poison corroding him from the inside out. "Asher, it's all your fault. You ruined me," he screamed, smashing everything within reach. "If I can't have it, neither can you. We can go to hell together." He activated his last resort, a hidden, encrypted channel to an offshore mercenary group. He emptied his secret accounts to hire a team of ruthless professionals. Their mission was simple: abduct Asher Thorne and make sure he didn't survive. Late that night, Asher was walking alone down a quiet, secluded road leading to the secluded guest house he was staying in. Suddenly, several unmarked vans screeched out of the darkness, boxing him in. A dozen menacing figures armed with pipes and crowbars jumped out. Their leader, a man with a jagged scar across his face, sneered as he advanced on Asher. "Kid, someone paid a lot of money for your life. Come with us quietly, and maybe we'll make it quick." Asher stopped, his gaze sweeping over the men without a flicker of surprise. Just then, a beat-up sedan careened around the corner and slammed on its brakes. Caleb leaped out, his hair wild, his eyes crazed. "Don't talk to him. Just do it. I want to watch him die," he shrieked to the mercenaries. The men charged. But in the next second, something impossible happened. The first few thugs, still several feet away from Asher, slammed into an invisible wall. They were hurled backward with the sickening crunch of breaking bones. The others froze, their attack faltering. Caleb's eyes widened in disbelief. "Shoot him! What are you waiting for? Shoot him!" he screamed. Two of the men drew handguns and fired. The bullets sliced through the air, but as they neared Asher, they slowed as if moving through thick molasses, finally dropping to the pavement at his feet with a metallic clink, their tips flattened and deformed. Silence. A dead, suffocating silence, broken only by Caleb's ragged, terrified gasps and the stunned disbelief of the hired killers. Asher finally moved. He stamped his foot once. An invisible wave of force radiated outward from him. Every single mercenary, including the Scarface leader, was thrown through the air as if hit by a speeding truck. They slammed into their vans with brutal force, collapsing into unconscious heaps. The only one left standing was Caleb, trembling uncontrollably. Asher walked toward him, each step a hammer blow to Caleb's heart. What kind of monster are you?" Caleb shrieked, his legs giving out as he collapsed to the ground. Asher stood over him, looking down not with anger or mockery, but with a chilling indifference, like a god observing an insect. "You've misunderstood something fundamental," Asher said. His voice had changed, echoing with a strange, multi-layered resonance. "I didn't come here to take what was yours." He gestured vaguely with one hand, at the dark road, at the distant city skyline, at the stars above. "This world, and everything in it, exists because I allow it to." Caleb's mind short-circuited, unable to process the words. "My time with the Vance family," Asher continued, with a hint of what sounded like boredom, was like a human playing a simulation game. A chance to experience so-called family, rivalry, betrayal. His eyes returned to Caleb's bloodless face. "And you," he said, pausing as he delivered the final, crushing judgment, were a particularly annoying bug in the program. "Now," Asher said flatly, "I'm bored." Caleb was paralyzed, his mind a whirlwind of incomprehensible concepts. Game. Bug. Bored. His entire reality, the foundation of his 20-year life, was being pulverized into dust. Fear, absolute and infinite, seized his soul. "Monster! While you are a monster!" The last thread of Caleb's sanity snapped. Fueled by pure, primal terror, he scrambled to his feet. He tore open his jacket, revealing a vest packed with high explosives. The detonator was already in his hand. "Die, die with me. Asher, I'll drag you to hell myself." His face was a mask of insanity as he yanked the trigger cord. A bright spark ignited. The timer began its frantic, high-pitched beep. "No!" Richard and Eleanor, having just arrived on the scene, screamed in despair. They could only watch in horror as the light of the impending explosion began to consume Caleb, poised to annihilate Asher, who stood only feet away. It was over. Everything was over. In that final, desperate moment, Asher frowned slightly. Not at the explosion. It was just noisy. He raised his right hand, and, as the destructive energy prepared to burst forth, he snapped his fingers. Snap! And time stopped. Shrapnel hung, suspended in the air. The ravenous tongues of the initial flame froze in mid-lick. Caleb's insane grin was locked on his face. Richard and Eleanor's outstretched hands were motionless. The sound of their screams was trapped in their throats. The wind itself ceased to blow. The entire world became a perfectly still, silent photograph. Only Asher moved. He walked calmly through the frozen tableau, stepping up to Caleb. He examined the motionless fireball and the undetonated explosives with the detached curiosity of someone pausing a movie. Death, he murmured to himself, shaking his head as if at a child's naive suggestion. That would be a release for you. He reached out a single finger and gently touched the heart of the frozen explosion. Disintegrate. Without a sound, the explosives and the unleashed chemical energy vanished. They were simply erased from existence, leaving no trace, no smoke, no memory. Then he turned his attention to Caleb, still frozen in his final, manic pose. Your punishment is not an ending. He snapped his fingers again. Snap! Time resumed its flow. The world-shattering explosion never happened. Caleb was still standing there, his body completing the motion of tearing open his jacket, but the vest was gone. The momentum sent him stumbling forward. He looked down at his empty torso, then at Asher, who stood before him, unharmed and impassive. No, impossible. Where are my explosives? He screamed, his voice cracking. Asher ignored the question. He spoke, and his words were not a threat, but a declaration of a new, unbreakable law. Caleb Vance, you will live. You will live forever as Caleb Vance, and you will be consciously aware of everything you have lost. Wealth, status, family, respect. Everything you once craved and built your identity upon will be forever out of your reach. You will be incapable of causing harm, directly or indirectly, to any person you perceive as an enemy. Your existence is now classified as absolutely harmless. The words settled over Caleb, not as sound, but as an irresistible cosmic force, weaving an invisible cage around his very soul. He felt it instantly. He tried to summon a thought of hatred toward Asher, to even form a curse in his mind, but a deep, fundamental power within him smoothed the thought away, leaving only a hollow void. He had been stripped of the ability to even hate. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a harmless waste. Asher spared him no further glance. He turned to Richard and Eleanor, who stood nearby, looking as if they had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. Their faces were a mask of post-traumatic shock, confusion at Caleb's fate, and an all-consuming terror of what Asher was. Asher looked at them, his eyes empty of any emotion. Game over. With those final words, his form began to flicker and blur, like a bad video signal. He dissolved into a cascade of tiny, shimmering particles of light that drifted up into the night sky and vanished. No goodbye, no final look, as if he had never been there at all. Left behind on the quiet road were Caleb, a soulless prisoner bound by cosmic law, and Richard and Eleanor, collapsed on the ground, staring at the empty space where their son had disappeared, their faces a portrait of infinite, hollow regret. A cool night wind rustled the trees. The Vance family drama, in a way that defied all human understanding, was finally over. Epilogue. Asher Thorne was gone. He left no paper trail, no financial records, no travel history. He had evaporated. The Vance family marshaled all their resources to find him, but it was like trying to find a specific drop of water in the ocean. Caleb was still alive. He was moved to a remote, isolated estate owned by the family, a place where he was out of sight and out of mind. Richard and Eleanor couldn't bear to look at him, but they also couldn't bring themselves to abandon him completely. His social media was deleted, his credit cards canceled. His only company was a silent, elderly caretaker who brought him his meals. He had tried to end his life. When he jumped from a balcony, an unseen force would gently float him back. When he cut his wrists, the wounds would heal in seconds, leaving no scar. When he refused to eat, his body would somehow draw the minimum necessary sustenance from the air itself. He was a prisoner, locked for eternity inside the body and name of Caleb Vance. The cosmic laws prevented him from even speaking a harsh word to his caretaker. The impulse would die in his throat before it could form. It was a prison more absolute than any built of steel. Richard and Eleanor, after the initial storm of grief, searching, and regret, eventually had to go on. The Vance Corporation still stood, but tarnished by the scandals and lacking both Caleb's cunning and Asher's terrifying potential, its influence began to wane. Sometimes they would sit in the vast, empty living room of their mansion, a heavy silence between them. Eleanor would trace the rim of a simple water glass Asher had once used. If only, she would whisper, if only we had been kinder to him from the start. Richard would stare out the window, his expression bleak. Kinder? Were we even worthy? He would remember Asher's final, indifferent gaze. It wasn't hatred or anger. It was the look of someone completely and utterly detached. To him, their family, their fortune, their entire lives. It had probably been less engaging than a mediocre video game. Regret became the permanent backdrop of their remaining years. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, in the ruins of a war-torn city, a young man sat crouched in the rubble of a collapsed apartment building. He wore a simple tactical vest, and his face was smudged with dirt, but his eyes held a calm that was profoundly out of place. In his lap, he held a little girl, so terrified she had forgotten how to cry. He was patiently feeding her small pieces of a protein bar. Stray bullets whistled in the distance. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. Several armed men in the mismatched uniforms of warring factions moved through the ruins. They saw the young man, but their eyes seemed to slide right past him, carefully giving him a wide berth, a flicker of something almost like reverence in their expressions. The young man finished feeding the girl and gently patted her back before handing her to a woman who came running, her face streaked with tears and dust. The woman sobbed her thanks in a language he didn't know. The young man just gave a slight nod and stood up. He gazed at the smoke-choked horizon, his eyes seeing something far beyond. Family Legacy Experience Module complete. Final rating, C-. Plot was derivative, NPC intelligence was low, and lacked overall originality. He murmured to himself, the corner of his mouth twitching in a wry, self-deprecating smile. All right, what should the next identity be? He tapped his chin thoughtfully. Combat medic? Or maybe disgraced heir to a lost fortune on a quest for treasure. Whatever. Let's randomize it. He snapped his fingers. His form wavered in the hazy air, fading like a mirage until he vanished completely, noticed by no one. Except for the little girl he had saved, who stared at the empty space where he had been and held out a small, curious hand. Deep in the cosmos, a consciousness beyond human comprehension sent a ripple through the fabric of infinite dimensions. The consciousness scanned an endless stream of data, located a completed experience module, tagged Urban Revenge Drama, and marked it as archived. Then, it turned its attention to the vast library of new games waiting to be played. A title on the list flickered, randomly selected. Current experience module, The Underdog Husband's Revenge, hard mode. Loading character profile. Enjoy your game. End.